I've learned over the years that the cases that stay with you the longest aren't always the loud ones. They aren't the ones filled with sirens and crowds and chaos. Sometimes, they're quiet. They happen in places that are supposed to be safe, behind doors that are supposed to stay closed, in lives that feel settled enough to finally rest. This is one of those cases. On the night of April 30th, 2012, Emma Winnall went to bed in her flat on Pensby Close in Moseley, Birmingham. She was 93 years old, a grandmother, a woman who had lived long enough to outlast wars, raise a family, and settle into a life defined by routine and familiarity. She lived alone, but she wasn't isolated. Carers checked in on her. She had structure. People knew her schedule. Nothing about that evening raised concern. No reports of trouble. No neighbors hearing arguments. No signs that anything was wrong. But sometime between that night and the early hours of the following morning, someone entered her home. Emma was attacked while she slept. That detail matters, because sleep is when we're most vulnerable, when we don't have time to prepare, when confusion comes before fear. By the time Emma realized what was happening, it was already too late. At around 8:30 the next morning, a carer arrived at the flat. What they found is something no one ever forgets. Emma was alive, but she was badly injured. She was covered in blood. She was screaming for help. Her injuries were obvious, severe, and shocking. Emergency services were called immediately. She was rushed to hospital, and that's when doctors began to understand just how violent the attack had been. Emma had suffered a fractured skull from multiple heavy blows. Her arm and wrist were broken. One of her fingers was partially severed. Investigators later said those injuries told a clear story. Emma likely woke up during the attack. She raised her arms instinctively to protect her face. She tried to defend herself. For a woman of her age, that kind of resistance took courage. But her body couldn't withstand that level of violence. The injuries were so severe that emergency surgery was required. Surgeons inserted metal plates into her arm to stabilize the damage. Emma survived in intensive care for nearly a month. On May 29, 2012, she died from complications caused by those injuries. An inquest later ruled her death an unlawful killing. From the beginning, detectives were faced with something deeply unsettling. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no damaged doors, no smashed windows. The flat was largely undisturbed. That meant whoever entered Emma's home didn't break in. They walked in, using a key. That single fact reshaped the entire investigation, because keys mean access, and access means familiarity. Forensic investigators combed through the flat. They found blood spattered on the wall near Emma's bed. Clear evidence of the assault itself. But what they didn't find was just as important. There were no bloody footprints leading away. No handprints on doors or furniture. No secondary blood transfers anywhere else in the home. The attacker hadn't wandered. They hadn't searched. They hadn't lingered. They entered, committed the assault, and left, quietly. Nothing was stolen. Money was left behind. Personal belongings were untouched. The flat wasn't ransacked. That ruled out a straightforward robbery. And it raised a harder question. If this wasn't about theft, then what was it about? In 2012, police arrested two people in connection with the case. A 56-year-old woman and a 28-year-old man. They were questioned, investigated, and eventually released. There wasn't enough evidence to charge them. And once again, the trail went cold. Over time, investigators explored several theories. None have led to an arrest. But each one tells us something about what might have happened. The first is what detectives call the keyholder theory. Since there was no forced entry, attention naturally focused on anyone who may have had legitimate access to Emma's home. Care workers, former care workers, people with spare keys, people who knew where keys were kept. That list is small, which makes the lack of answers even more troubling, because access narrows the field. But it also raises the stakes. Another theory suggests a burglary gone wrong, that someone entered intending to steal, only to be startled when Emma woke up. Fear can explain panic. Panic can explain violence. But this theory has gaps. Why take nothing? Why leave money behind? Why use such extreme force and then retreat without searching the flat? Burglary doesn't usually end in restraint. Emma's son Peter once suggested the possibility of mistaken identity. that perhaps his mother was confused for someone else, someone connected to local criminal activity. Police later stated they found no evidence supporting that idea. Still, it speaks to the confusion left behind. When answers don't come, people search for explanations anywhere they can. Some believe the nature of the attack points to something more personal. Emma was attacked in her bed, not confronted, not argued with. She was vulnerable. That has led some to believe the attacker targeted her because of that vulnerability. Not out of rage, not out of chaos, but because she couldn't fight back. Then there's what forensic teams quietly refer to as the quiet retreat. It's not an official term you'll find in reports. It's the kind of phrase investigators use among themselves when something about a scene doesn't sit right. Because inside Emma Winnall's flat, the evidence stops almost as suddenly as it begins. Blood was found where the assault happened, on the wall near the bed, exactly where you would expect it to be, given the violence of the attack. But nowhere else. No bloody footprints leading down the hallway, no smears on door frames, no handprints on light switches, furniture, or walls. Nothing that suggests movement beyond that small space. That absence matters. Like violence like this usually leaves a trail. People move. They stumble. They reach out without thinking. Blood transfers from one surface to another without effort. But here, it didn't. Which suggests the attacker either left immediately, stepping back the way they came without touching anything else, or they had a plan to avoid leaving behind what couldn't be explained later. That kind of control doesn't come from panic. It doesn't come from surprise. It comes from forethought, from someone who knew exactly how long they needed to be there, and exactly how to leave. And when you put that alongside everything else, the lack of forced entry, the absence of theft, the timing of the attack, the quiet retreat becomes one of the most unsettling parts of this case, because it suggests the attacker didn't just want to get away. They expected to. Today, the case remains unsolved. West Midlands police say it's periodically reviewed, especially as forensic science advances. A reward has been offered in the past through Crime Stoppers, but no suspect has been charged. No answers delivered. Someone entered a 93-year-old woman's home while she slept. They didn't force their way in. They didn't break a lock or shatter a window. They used a key, a small ordinary object, the kind that's meant to keep danger out, not invite it in. They crossed a familiar threshold, walked into a place that held a lifetime of memories, a place where nothing about that night suggested it would be her last. They committed extreme violence against someone who had no real way to escape it, someone who was vulnerable, someone who trusted the quiet of her own home. And then, they left. Not running. Not calling attention to themselves. Quietly. They closed the door behind them and stepped back into the world as if nothing had happened, which means someone, somewhere, knows exactly what took place in that flat on Pensby Close. They know how they got inside. They know how long they stayed. They know what they did. Maybe they believed time would bury it. The years passing would dull the details, soften the memory, make the truth harder to reach. Maybe they thought silence would protect them, that if they said nothing long enough, the weight would disappear. But silence doesn't work that way. It doesn't fade. It doesn't dissolve. It settles. And with every passing year it grows heavier. Because the truth has a way of waiting. And it doesn't forget. I'm Detective Pennyworth, and this is one of those cases that reminds you of home is supposed to be safe. It's supposed to be the one place where the world can't reach you, where the door closes and the noise stays outside, where familiarity brings comfort instead of fear. Night is supposed to bring rest. It's meant to be the time when vigilance fades, when the lights go out and the body finally lets go, when sleep comes without suspicion. An age is supposed to bring peace, a slowing down, a sense that the hardest parts of life are behind you, that what remains is quiet, routine, and care. But sometimes, those promises don't hold. Sometimes safety is broken without warning. Sometimes rest is interrupted by violence. And sometimes peace is taken from those who should have been most protected. And that's what makes cases like this so difficult to sit with. Because they don't announce themselves. They don't leave chaos behind. They leave absence. They leave questions that echo louder precisely because everything else went quiet. The quietest crimes leave the loudest questions. And those questions don't go away just because time passes. If you want to stay with these stories and the truths behind them, you can subscribe to the channel. We'll keep telling the cases that don't always come with answers, but still deserve to be heard. Because remembering is sometimes the only justice that's left.